We'll call the finance meeting to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I need a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Toko, support by Duge. Please vote on your iPad. Yeah, it passes 11-0. I need a motion to approve the minutes. Moved by Kraft, support by Leonetti. I didn't know which one of you said that. Comments or questions? Please vote on your iPad. Is that this one here? Okay, there it is. Motion passes 11-0. Okay, public participation. Does anyone wish to be heard?
Good afternoon, Macomb County Board of Commissioners Finance Committee. There's only really one item that I'm going to be speaking about. That's the introduction of the fiscal year budget. I picked up a copy at the door that said, "Don't let it leave the room," so make sure that you catch me before I leave with it. One of the areas within the budget that I feel is absolutely useless is over in the County Executive Office under professional support. There's a public information officer whose salary range is $60,000 to $75,000. Primarily when I looked into who the public information officer is and what activities that they perform to the taxpayers of the County of Macomb, it doesn't look like this public information officer is actually involved with providing public information from the County of Macomb to the general public. The public information officer is only involved in promoting the Office of County Executive only. So therefore, I would say that we could save ourselves $75,000 by eliminating that position. Over in the area of the budget under community and mental health, I see that therapist twos have a range from $49,000 to $61,000, and I know that there was a therapist that came here and spoke to the board several times over the last 7 months regarding that basically because she's a sociologist, that she's going to come here and actually utilize the taxpayer dollars to whine and complain about Karen the clerk. You know that I know Karen the clerk, and as a direct result of knowing Karen the clerk, I know that she submitted a very detailed, very specific budget to the Office of County Executive, and through media reports it was determined that she didn't turn anything in. That is absolute fabrication of the truth. She went through the various line items, the special revenue funds, CPL remonumentation, automation, as well as clerk and register of deeds. Got a head count, formulated a very workable plan. However, it was at the resistance of the Finance Department and the Office of County Executive for that budget to be presented in its original form to the Board of Commissioners. And I know that you have animosity towards her and her changes that she's implementing. And a lot of the issues come back down to when I was at the budget last year, I said you need to allocate money towards outside legal services, a separate website for the Clerk and Register of Deeds office, and finally the issue comes down to a forensic audit of the funds that are being taken in on a daily basis through the court system, through the Register of Deeds, and through vital records, and have that accountable through the Treasurer's Office to the taxpayers of Macomb. It would seem that through the media reports, when it was indicated that Karen didn't turn in a budget, that basically nobody ever asked Karen why she didn't turn in a budget. So she turned it in. You didn't see it. She'll present it next week. But like I say, get rid of the Public Information Officer. It's a completely useless position in the Office of County Executive because it does not serve the taxpayers of Macomb. It only serves the executive. I'll leave it at that. I could talk on the budget for hours, but at the same time, I do want to point out that those check registers that appear at the end of every month on the website provided by Finance.
Okay, you're getting off of the budget now. You're
Budget.
talking about check registers on a website, so.
All right, yeah, that goes into the budget because there's income and expenditures. That's what a budget is. And
Right, but this is for next year. Those expenses haven't occurred yet. Listen, we're having a lot of hearings of the public today, apparently, so there's gonna be an opportunity if you,
Okay, no, I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
all right, thank you. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Anyone else wish to be heard? Seeing none, we'll close the first hearing of the public. Okay, presentation, introduction of the fiscal year 18 budget. You're on.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Hopefully on your iPads you have a 13-slide PowerPoint presentation, which is a high-level overview of the budget. Many of the slides refer to the general fund. The opening slides are more of a high-level overview of the entire budget. So we'll go ahead and start on slide 2. And the total budget across all funds and all activities for the county for 2018, as recommended by the Executive's Office, is a little over $726 million, which is about a $900,000 or $950,000 increase over 2017, which may seem very small on its surface. There's another slide which will highlight changes. There's some big swings in about 4 departments that end up resulting in that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Again, there's a $27 million increase in the Department of Roads. There's gas and weight tax increases and federal funding that are resulting in increased activity in projects, and there's reductions in the general fund, Homeland Security grants, and mental health. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute or two on another slide. The general fund budget is just shy of $229 million. That's a $6 million decrease from 2017. A lot of that, and most of it, is driven by capital needs, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. So that $6 million decrease is composed of a $10 million decrease in the contribution to the capital plan. That's all predicated on issuing $20 million of bonds next year to fund the capital plan, which then reduces the cash needs of the general fund. And then that's offset by a $4 million increase in all other expenses in the general fund, personnel, operating, contract services, those kinds of expenses. There's a budgeted contribution from the general fund to the capital improvement fund.
Right.
Of $7 million in 2018, $18 million in 19, and $11 million in 2020. That's in this budget cycle. Again, on the next meeting, we're going to be talking about the capital plan in more detail. So that's a 5-year plan. And at the end of this presentation, we'll be talking about a 10-year forecast of the general fund, which we'll talk more again about future contributions to the capital plan in the out years, as I'll refer to them. We added 16 positions to the budget in total across all funds. The net cost of the general fund for all of those positions is about $428,000. There's another schedule later on that details those additions by department. We flowed through a 2% property tax increase, a 1% across the board wage increase, which we have brought before you before in terms of our wage settlements, 4% healthcare inflation, which is consistent with prior years. And just a side note, we increased our funding to Meals on Wheels and Community Action by an additional $50,000 for 2018. Moving on to slide 3, this is a high-level overview of total expenses by fund. So you'll see I've highlighted 4 of those funds that I talked about earlier that are kind of driving the increase. Again, the total expenses for the general fund are down about $6 million in 18 from 17 because of the capital contribution. Homeland Security grants, the budget for 18 as we stand today is about $4.4 million less than 2017. The more tenured commissioners will probably remember this, and for the newer commissioners, Vicki Wolber gets Homeland Security grants in 3-year blocks. And so you'll get money and you'll have 3 years to spend it. At this point in time, she doesn't have her next allocation yet. So generally what happens is sometime after the budget's approved, that 3-year cycle is approved, Vicki will come back before you, as she has in past years, and ask for a budget amendment. So that is why that's showing a decrease. Roads, when we talk about the roads budget with Brian Santo in the future, gas and weight tax increases are driving revenues in the road department, and that's driving projects, if you will, as well as there's an item on the agenda for the infrastructure committee later today that we've already flowed through the budget to amend the 2017 budget by $9 million downward. That was put in the 17 budget to build a new maintenance facility over on 15 Mile Road. That is not happening within the 2017 budget cycle, so we're flowing that into the 18 budget cycle. And then community mental health has had a big decrease, as you all know, in Medicaid funding. So that's driving down revenues and corresponding expenses in the mental health department. All the other increases are, you know, in my mind, minor in nature, and that drives down to the bottom line of the net $952,000 increase in the total budget countywide. Slide 4 is a pie graph. This is more informational in nature, indicating that the general fund is only about 30% of the total county budget, although that's where most of the focus is at, because that's where most of the tax dollars go to fund discretionary programs as well as mandatory programs. Mental health and substance abuse is another 28%, roads is 19%, and then all the other activities presented on the previous slide represent 22% of the budget. So general fund, mental health, substance abuse, roads, those three funds represent 78% of the budget. Slide 5 is a representation or a presentation of the 16 positions that were added. The left-hand side of that slide indicates all the positions that were requested, which were about 25 and a half. The right-hand slide includes or presents the 16 that were approved, and again, the general fund portion is about $428,000. The remaining $714,000 is either funded by grant revenue, reductions in overtime, or just new allocations from the state through mainly the health department. Moving on to slide 6. Slide 6 is a very high-level overview of the general fund budget compared 17 to 18. You'll see that there's a $2.5 million increase in property taxes, which is 2%. There's other increases in charges for services because we've added positions in the animal shelter for contracts and such and so forth. Same thing with the sheriff's department for road patrol contracts. On the expense side, salaries and wages are increasing about 4.2%, and I'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit. That's driven by a number of factors. Fringe benefits, I'll talk about that in a minute. That's actually going down, which is driven by the way we're allocating pension and healthcare costs, retiree healthcare costs, I should say, now that our pension plans are closed. Supplies and commodities, it's a 1.8% increase. It's $500,000 across the entire general fund. Not much of concern there. Contract services, about $879,000 increase. That's driven by primarily by a $500,000 increase in jail medical costs at the sheriff's department. That continues to rise every year. Capital outlay, that's down about $1 million. The sheriff's department has applied for port security grants the last couple of years. Those grants are not available, as well as we had some carry forwards for the armored personnel carrier from 16 into 17, as well as the body cameras. So those carry forwards are no longer happening going forward into 18 because those items were purchased in 2017. At the bottom of this slide, we always like to point out that of the surplus or deficit that we're budgeting for the general fund, which for 2018 we're budgeting a drawdown of just shy of $4 million in the general fund. We make a distinction between the amount that we're generating from day-to-day operations, if you will, versus how much we're contributing to the capital plan for our infrastructure needs. So for 2018, our day-to-day operations are providing about a $3 million surplus. In other words, the existing revenue sources are sufficient to cover the day-to-day operations on a departmental level. Salaries, wages, benefits, office supplies, whatever you have. But that $7 million contribution to the capital plan is then resulting in a deficit for the year, if you will. We're still gonna have fund balance. I don't wanna say we're in a negative fund balance situation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But we make a distinction about, are we structurally balanced, if you will, versus our capital needs. And we've talked over and over the last couple budget cycles about our infrastructure needs and IT needs and things of that nature. So, again, moving on to slide 7. So we talked earlier about a 4% increase in salaries and wages. That's made up of a 1% across the board wage increase that I mentioned earlier. We reduced our turnover factor from 6% to 5%. So that's about a 1% change in personnel costs, if you will, increased. We added the new positions. We have new deployment schedules for what we call the blue coats, or the protective service officers, because of the opening of the old county building at the end of 16, as well as here in the admin building. We actually, at the time we built the budget, we were also budgeting security over at the Telmer building, which is, everybody's probably aware, we've now pulled that security out. It's still in the budget. It's about $100,000. The decrease in fringe benefits, you'll see this across. The only reason I mention this is you'll see this as we go through the department hearings, that the retiree health care and pension line item is going to be reduced in almost every department. The reason for that is, until 2017 and through 2017, we were budgeting retiree health care costs and pension costs on an employee-by-employee basis, even for the new people. So the folks that hired in 16 and 17, we were budgeting defined benefit costs for those folks, which they didn't really qualify for because they hired in 16 and after the plan was closed. What we're now doing is we're taking the required contribution that the actuaries tell us we have to make, and we're just dividing it basically based on the census by department at the end of 2015 when the plans were closed. That's resulted in a decrease in the budget. Not necessarily the contributions that we're making to the plans, but budgetarily, it's reducing pension and healthcare costs by about $1.9 million across all the departments. Then that's, of course, offset by increases in employee healthcare costs and workers' comp charges and fringe benefits like FICA and Medicare. We talked about the increase in contract services being driven primarily by jail medical, and I talked a little bit about the reduction in capital outlay. Slide 8 is a informational slide, really, about the change in total expenses by department, coming down to the $6 million decrease. And you'll see it ranges up or down by department, whether we've added positions to a department or maybe we reduced expenses a little bit. Some departments like the health department asked for some increases in certain areas. So this is kind of an informational slide. The next two slides, again, are pie graph representations of our revenue sources and our expenditure sources. Slide 9 is the revenue sources, basically just indicating that a little over 50% of our revenues in the general fund come from property taxes and 16% from state sources. So revenue sharing, liquor tax, court financing, those sorts of things. Slide 10. Similar representation of our expenses. You'll see that about 60% of our expenses in the general fund are personnel-related, salaries and benefits. The transfer outline item of 20% includes contributions to the capital improvement fund, as well as transfers to the grant programs like front of the court, child care fund, the health grants, sheriff grants, community action, all of those departments. I always like to talk about slide 11, which is a representation of the effect of Proposition A. So as you know, Proposition A limits the rate of increase in property tax assessments to the lesser of inflation, or 5%. So you'll see that in 2008 to 2012, we had a huge decrease. It's about a 27% decrease as a result of the recession. We've had some modest increases. We've actually exceeded our 2% target for a couple of years. But what I'm trying to represent here is starting in 17 and 18, if we grow at 2% growth, which is what we're budgeting, it's going to take us to 2024 to get back to where we were in 2008. So 1% change is about $1.1 million in revenue. 2% is about $2.1 million. Our wage increases are about, our wage expense is close to what our property tax revenue is. So if you get a 1% change there, you got a 1% increase in wages. Our property tax increase is covering our wage increases, basically. So it's going to take a while longer to get back to where we were 7 or 8, 9 years ago. Slide 12 is a 10-year forecast. So we spend generally some fair amount of time each year talking about this. The major assumptions here are, again, a 2% increase in property taxes every year, 1% growth in revenues, and 1% growth in all other expenses. I've flowed through, or we've flowed through in my office, the effect of this $20 million bond issue and the associated contributions to the capital plan. And healthcare increases at 4% a year. And what you'll see is at the bottom, the very, very bottom, is a representation of what the fund balance is as a percentage of the expenditures of the general fund. We prefer that that be somewhere around 20%. Industry guidelines would tell you that it should be between 15 and 20%. If we, let me back up one step. We know that we never spend every dollar that we budget. There are safety nets in the budget, but the departments are very diligent about watching their P's and Q's, if you will, and we generally do not spend more than the budget. In fact, we're generally $2.5 to $3.5 million under budget. So I've flowed through a 5% favorable budget variance, if you will. So we'll spend 95% of our budget as opposed to 100. If that all happens over the next 10 years, we go to a low point of just under 15%. That's in 2021. That's when our capital needs are kind of relieved a little bit. We start generally increasing. At that point, the funding to the capital plan, we're assuming is going to be about $10 million a year starting in 2023. What starts happening in 2023 is our debt service starts reducing. So we have bond payments that are maturing, or bond issues that are maturing. So our debt service requirements start dropping off in 2023, 24. They start dropping off more in 25. That's why we're seeing an increase in our fund balance starting out in those later years. In fact, I believe it's in 2025, the only bond issues we would have outstanding would be the retiree health care issue that we issued in 2015 and the $45 million that we issued in 2015 for the downtown renovation project, and the $20 million that we're assuming that we will issue next year for our capital needs. So it's not a bad story. It's not necessarily a good story. We'd like that to be closer to 20% in all years. So the message that I have is that we need to be very careful about our discretionary spending going forward. So those are programs that are not necessarily required by state law or things of that nature. So we call it discretionary. The more I get, call you, the more tenured commissioners may have seen, we've had schedules of discretionary spending versus, non-discretionary in prior years. So that's just my message is our capital needs, and we'll talk about that again in the next committee, are very, very great. We just need to watch our discretionary spending. The last slide of the presentation folds in the effect of the delinquent tax revolving fund. So when we go to the bond rating agencies, they consider the delinquent tax revolving fund as part of the total equity in terms of our funding level. They like to see that at 75% of expenses of the general fund. You'll see that in 2018, we're still budgeting above that 75% level. For a few years, we dropped down below. It's not critically below, but we're below 70 actually. And then we start driving back upwards in 2024 is when it starts to recover, again, because our debt service needs are dropping off, if you will, starting in 2023-24 time frame. So again, this is kind of just a framework of where we kind of need to be. We're assuming in this slide here that the delinquent tax fund is producing a surplus of about $900,000 a year. It contributes $8 million a year to the general fund now. It has for many years. We assume and we budgeted that will continue and still produce about a $900,000 surplus, is what they produced last year. Fortunately, the economy has started, been recovering in the last few years, and the delinquencies are down, and they're starting to level off around the $40 million range. So it's something we need to watch. We need to be diligent. I say that every year. So that's my comments.
Okay, what I'd like to do is, we don't want to ask on individual departments because we're going to go through those in the future, but any questions, generally speaking, about the budget, this slide presentation, or the beginning pages of the budget, anything in that area that wasn't in here? Well, yeah, that's also in the slide presentation. Some of these aren't, but any of the beginning of it before the budget starts. So, do we have any questions? I don't have any speakers on. Commissioner Myjack.
I will speak if there's no one here to speak. Thanks for coming here, Mr. Smigiel. Very interesting presentation. I just have maybe a couple questions pertaining to our property tax millage in the county. And this is just coming from me, my opinions and thoughts. I can't speak for other commissioners. I was here about 10 years ago when we had to raise the millage rate from 4.2 mils to 4.5. We had cut, I think that was about $80 million back then that we cut over 4 years. And we increased the millage rate that amount to get $10 million extra a year. My thoughts back then were, and I did support that millage increase, I voted in favor of it, was we needed to do that during the bad times to get out of our situation. The county was very diligent and very responsible in the budget with getting a balanced budget and limiting jobs through attrition. You know all this. Mm-hmm. If I'm wrong with anything, please correct me. And I've seen, obviously times are getting better, not as great, as they were where we want to be. And just something I've thought of just personally as a commissioner and just as a taxpayer is my thoughts are I'd like to see our tax rate go back down to 4.2 mils to what it was. We needed to do it then for about a 10-year period to get out of the situation we were in. We're a little bit better situation now. And your thoughts on that at all?
Can't afford it.
Can't afford it. Why can?
Because that raised $10 million 8-9 years ago.
Right.
It's primarily driven by our capital needs. We have so many infrastructure needs that we'll talk about in the next committee, mm-hmm. that if we decrease that to 4.2 mils, you can see that another $10 million a year is, we would, if we reduced property taxes by $10 million a year and didn't reduce expenses correspondingly,
Right,
put it that way.
right.
If we want to continue to provide services at the level we're providing them today, that is not a possibility to reduce the property taxes. Because $10 million a year in 3 or 4 years, we would have no fund balance.
So if that were to take place, then we would have to have what we're talking about. Why does it have to be on the capital side? I mean, why are you saying that it would just be why not, you know, I mean, I'm looking here, we increased, 16 positions this last year. I'm thinking out loud here, how many positions have we added, since we froze, you know, hirings back 10 years ago? Where are we at on the plus side? We've added 50 total jobs or something like that? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know the number.
you know,
No, we've
from the-
added more than that, but some of them are funded through contracts.
But just the other side of the story is,
Yeah.
hey, maybe we need to keep a
Yeah, all
lid
I'm
on
saying
hiring
is-
new positions.
Yeah,
you know.
I mean, if you think about $10 million in expenses, if you're going to address capital needs, which ultimately will need to be addressed one way or the other, because you have HVAC units that are old and need to be replaced and things of that nature that Lynn will talk about. If you want to reduce expenses by $10 million, in an average salary of a position is $50,000, so if you roll up the benefits, maybe you're talking $80,000. You know, you're talking over 100 positions.
Yeah, I see. Just one final comment thought is just that, you know, I'm here as a county commissioner representing the residents, county government. I care about the county government, but, you know, my thoughts are with the residents also and their property tax bill they get every year and the amount of you know, new millages that voters have voted on. And so I kind of look at it from the resident side also. I look at it also, I think residents are treated unfairly through the law. You know, there's a lot of, how can I say this, reduction in taxes on the business side of people's taxes, for businesses, excuse me, and the burden, the shift of burden
Right.
for residents over probably the last 40 years has shifted more to residents. And I think that's not to you, but that's just everyone where I'm coming from with this. So thanks
Yep,
for your
you're
comments.
welcome.
So, thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Chair Smith?
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, for your presentation. I have two questions. Regarding the 2% property tax that you have baked in, is that what what's forecasting? What's actually been happening? Like, you know, in 17, where are we at with that? And is that what's
We were at 2.88 for 17.
Mm-hmm.
We had another Headley rollback. We're projecting just about that.
too safe, I guess is
Yeah.
what we're saying? Too
Yeah, I'd
kind of
rather be
built into
conservative
your
on the
safe,
revenue side.
Okay.
We were a little over 3%, I think, the year before. So, you know, as we know, the real estate market is, you know, very favorable in so far this year, which that will roll into the sales study at the end of this year, which will ultimately affect 18.
Mm-hmm.
So we may be higher than that. I don't really know. So I'm just trying to be safe.
And then my main question is, this $20 million bond that you're talking about, that unless I'm missing something, I've never really, I've never heard any talk about this last year that we were doing, and I could be wrong, but am I missing something? Was this part of the plan last year for the 5-year plan so that we could keep these, you know, the general fund value at where it was and the percentage? I don't ever remember hearing about another $20 million bond proposal.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about it last year, but if you look at the capital plan this year and all the needs, then there's a requirement,
Well,
unless we take things completely off the plan.
right, but I understand. So we had a whole 5-year list of capital plan anticipation and everything. So last year we had a 5-year plan that included 18 and 19 and 20, and we didn't see this amount of capital need back then that we were going to have to do it. What changed, I guess, is my question. Did something all of a sudden pop up out of the blue that we're not, that
We do
weren't-
have some things popping up. For example, Years ago, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, we put in the 800 megahertz radio system. So now there's a need to replace those radios.
Right, well, I remember
So it's about
Vicki
$6 million.
talking about that.
Pardon?
I remember her talking about that. So
Yeah, we
that's
didn't
not-
roll it into the plan a year ago. We're rolling it into the plan now.
Okay, and we didn't, I guess my point is, do we not know about that before? I mean, obviously, you know, all of this comes with a plan, they all come with a life cycle. I mean, where are we dropping the ball at where, I mean, next year, are we gonna come with we need another $20 million bond issue? You know what I'm saying? And this is kind of I mean, to me, it's kind of a big surprise. I don't know about anybody else, but in order to keep true to what you know, the budget was designed around last year, we also, this year, have to add an extra $20 million of borrowing. So this is kind of confusing to me.
The 800 megahertz system, yeah, we didn't include that in the plan last year. There are other needs and other requests that have popped up. There's about $88 million, I think, in the plan for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So as we roll out every year, there are more requests that come along, and you'll see that in the plan.
Right.
So
But isn't that something we ask of all our department heads, is to kind of give us that when you're looking at a 5-year plan? I mean, don't we go right to these departments and say, listen, you know, we're trying to get an accurate 5-year plan together, so you need to, as a department head or, you know, wherever, you know, elected official, whatever it is, give us a realistic version of what we're looking at in the next 5 years, so that you don't do all this work last year with a 5-year
Right.
budget, and then all of a sudden you're $20 million short this year. I mean, that to me doesn't, something just doesn't feel right about that. And never having heard about it till now, I'm sorry, but, you know, this is kind of a surprise that this will be the first that I would hear about it, getting, you know, these numbers. And we were looking at these numbers earlier, and we were trying to figure out that $20 million and
Right.
where it came from.
Right.
And to just hear about it at the budget presentation is a little disappointing to me, that we didn't have at least a discussion about it beforehand to talk more about it, so we don't have to do it now. And I'm sure we will have more of a discussion about it after this.
yeah, we will. Yeah.
I just don't, it just seems like a big surprise.
Excuse me, good afternoon,
To answer-
Commissioners. Is this on? Referencing your comment about who dropped the ball, and nobody dropped the ball.
And I don't want to blame anybody
Well,
in particular, I'm just saying this is a...
But that's what you said, and a lot of work goes into presenting the material that's being presented to this board today. And I take offense to the fact that, you know, it's being referenced as somebody dropped the ball. There's no surprises here. It is what it is. I think that this discussion would be better had once you see in totality our capital needs, which you'll be seeing later on tonight in the 5-year presentation of the capital plan. So I would ask that you or other commissioners reserve judgment on what happened here. This was stemmed from the executive's office in finance, when what's going to kill us here if we don't address it is our capital infrastructure needs. Municipalities across this nation, when we had a great recession, start putting roofs and boilers and everything on the back burner because they were more focused on providing service to the public. We're in catch-up mode right now. And the $65 million or what we're spending down here downtown is just scratching the surface of all of the county facility needs of county-owned buildings. The $65 million is not going to cure everything. And as we took a look at the new 5-year plan, the updated plan, and there are things added to the 18 capital plan that you didn't see last year because things came on the radar. Things maybe had a shorter expected life than we thought they were going to have. So you will see that, and it's shaded in different colors so you can see what was added to the list in 18, 19, 20 that wasn't there in previous years. So again, I only ask that you reserve judgment and we look at the big picture. Thank you.
So, of course, I'll tell you again, I don't mean any one particular drop in the ball, and I'm certainly not saying you, but I mean $20 million is a large sum to come up from one year to the next. So, of course, we're going to hear all about the capital plan and what's new on that. It wasn't on there last year. But I'm just, I'd say I'd be disappointed. I'd be remiss to say that I'm not disappointed to not hear a little bit about this $20 million, plan before the public meeting. That's it. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Before I call on Commissioner Drillette, I just, in defense of Chair Smith, I don't think he's talking about dropping the ball on the planning with regard to capital plan and capital outlay, which we'll get into the differences later. If we really had open communication between the departments, we wouldn't be sitting here looking at each other like, did you hear about that before? No, did you hear about that? That's what he's talking about when dropping the ball. And with that, Commissioner Gillette.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Steve, for the presentation. I look forward to digging deeper into the budget, and I thank you for the overview. Just a quick follow-up on some of the comments by Commissioner Smigiel. You had mentioned that during the Great Recession, the county had to sometimes put on hold, or local, I believe it was the deputy, some of the governmental units had to put off some capital gains things, whether it's fixing a boiler and that sort of thing. I just think it's important to remember that our constituents put off a lot of things during the Great Recession too. Obviously, they put off, fixing things or sending a child to school or getting a new car or repairing a car. And I remember very vividly, even though I wasn't on the Board of Commissioners, that the board did indeed decide to raise taxes on these folks at the most difficult time in their economic lives to protect the county's budget. And I know that it was a very difficult decision for that board, but they did that at the expense of the citizens' budgets who are also suffering. And when you mentioned that we can't afford to reduce that millage rate that we increased on people at a time when they could least afford to pay it, I would hope that we could at least look toward a scheduled reduction that we can phase in as property values have come back, and as I realize property values come back more quickly than what we're allowed to recapture under Proposal A. But I would hope that we could maybe look toward a schedule of doing that, even if it's at the expense maybe of some capital projects that maybe we can afford to put off a little longer if at all possible. I don't know how bad off the 200 megahertz system is, and maybe we could, or 800 megahertz, maybe we could buy with fewer megahertz or something. But it would be nice to look for a way to schedule a reduction back to what the rate was for many years prior to increasing it on taxpayers at the time that was most difficult for them to have to pay it. The county collected extra money at a very difficult time. I think we should try to look for some ways that we could scale it back, even if we have to phase it in. So that's just my perspective going into the budget. I don't expect you to, reply in specific, but I am interested in hearing then what is being done and how we're moving forward in these departments. So I appreciate you putting together this document and the work that your department has done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Romano.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for coming, Mr. Smigiel. Mine are a couple of softball questions. Incidentally, I agree with Commissioner Drulette and Commissioner Smigiel. Having said that, I'll go into my two softball questions. When our general fund is, as you said, would be comfortable somewhere around 15%, I'm sorry, I'm using my words, not yours, but somewhere around 15%, and I look and see that we have these bond issues out there that we're paying on, would it not behoove us to prepay these or pay these off? And in the event that we do, I know that would drop our fund balance, but at the same time, the interest that we would save from paying off these bonds go back into the general fund. Wouldn't it be a kind of a comparison of both in saving us money?
We do that. We analyze market conditions. We'll refinance when we can. A lot of these bonds, the newer ones, we can't even think about doing what you're suggesting for 8 or 10 years. We have call provisions. So to get more favorable interest rates from the investors, we have to wait a certain period of time. So we're constantly analyzing that, and we would save, you're right, we would save interest money. It's a matter of how low do we want to drive our rainy day fund, if you will, before we start risking downgrades and things of that nature.
Okay, my other question would be referring to that. So if our fund balance is below that 15% or somewhere around, let's say 10%, and we go out for bonding, does it cost us more because our fund balance is lower? Mm-hmm. Two simple questions.
Yep.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of things with respect to lowering the tax rate. Commissioners, I want to remind you, look on page 11 of this presentation. Every time I hear we need to lower it back down to what it used to be, I'm so frustrated at the lack of knowledge of our tax structure, which is on the state to fix, and nobody up there is willing to do it. We need a constitutional amendment is what we need. What that shows you, though, is even though property values have been rising, our ability to get back to where we were in 2007 is going to take years and years and years. So whoever told you we had a 10-year fix wasn't being honest, because anybody who understood the tax structure would have understood there's no bounding back from this, because we can't. And with respect to the residents in hard times, their property values can return. Ours don't when theirs do. They also could, no, don't raise your hand because you had the floor before. Now I have the floor, and you can put your name on the list to speak again. With respect to jobs and everything else, that's a whole different ballgame. But we are not rebounding it because of the Michigan tax structure, and that's why I think you're going to see a lot of folks in other cities and other counties really coming into some serious financial trouble. With respect to the 20 million, I want to clarify a few things. The budget that you gave us, the long term through 2025, that's with the expectation that we just did 65 million, and we're doing 20 million next year, and we don't do any more through 2025. No more bonding. That's the expectation. Correct. There. Mm-hmm. It's also the expectation that there will be no new, unexpected, unforeseen needs, or that we're correctly figuring out how much we're going to need to pay for technology. So we have years coming out here that we're assuming things, and we already know from just the last couple of years that our assumptions haven't been on target. Would you agree with that?
In terms of our capital needs?
Yes.
Yeah, new requests keep appearing on the capital plan.
And
so
I think it's logical to assume that between now and 2025, there will be unforeseen new requests. When we did the 65 million, there was, and let me get into the other thing, because we're really good. It's up to us. If we want to slash this budget and cut positions and everything, it's up to us to do that. I don't know that everybody here has the heart to do something of that nature. But I want to clarify another thing. Capital outlay and capital plan are two different things, correct? And would you define the two?
So the capital plan generally includes things of an infrastructure nature, either in buildings or IT or projects in IT. Capital outlay would be more, we don't really have much of that in the general fund, so that would be more like equipment that we buy for a department here or there, or boats or something where we get a grant.
Isn't capital outlay, generally speaking, in government budgets, infrastructure issues, though?
No, not necessarily. It could be cars, it could be
well, yeah, no,
equipment.
I'm not saying exclusively. I'm saying also.
Also,
we have what we call a capital plan, but that's not in our budget. But
the funding for the capital plan is in the budget.
The funding to come out of the general fund into a budget that we do not approve.
Correct.
This is where I'm trying to get. In other governmental units, there isn't this separate entity that they don't approve. So aren't those projects, when you take a computer system with the program for the budgets, and you have a line for capital outlay, isn't it generally speaking, generally accepted across the state, across the country, isn't that generally the place where infrastructure as well as equipment, large trucks, things of that, isn't that generally the place? Now, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm going to clarify because I think that the commissioners have some dirty hands on this situation. But isn't that, generally speaking, where infrastructure expenditures would go?
It can be all over the board, Commissioner, depending on the entity. So you'll have funds that are called capital projects funds, which are for large projects. We have a capital improvement fund, which is a capital projects fund. It funds other capital projects funds. That's not uncommon for governments to have capital projects funds, which are not required to be budgeted.
Okay, but all of our other funds that aren't general funds are in our budget. The capital plan is not in our budget, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and I don't know the exact history of it, but it has something to do with an agreement between the commissioners and the county exec's office after 2012 as to what the commission would and wouldn't approve. Do you know the history on that?
Well, we're required to submit a capital plan by charter each year, and then we provide funding for it in the general fund, which...
Right, but we don't approve
Pardon?
We don't approve the plan, so we don't remove things or add things. We don't
Correct.
approve the plan.
Correct.
Okay, so we have a lot of new commissioners, and I wanted them to understand that. Because, and I've expressed this before, my opinion, when it comes to overseeing a budget and doing our fiduciary responsibility, from my experience in other jobs that I've held of this nature, the area that you want to watch the closest if you are watching for anything wrong, which I do not believe is happening here, and I want to make sure I'm making that clear, that is the area of the budget that you would keep your eyes on. It's not the general expenditures for employees and fringe benefits and everything else. And this body has abdicated our right to do that. So I just wanted to make that clear to the new commissioners that that's
If I could add something, Commissioner, what you do see, if we have a project on the plan and it requires a contract, you'll see the contract to fund that project.
Yes. So with the 65 million, we've had a number of cost overruns for very good reasons and legitimate reasons, and a lot of them were to do capital plan stuff within the 65 million since the walls were down or everything. But did this commission vote on any of the change orders that would have been over $50,000?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay. And well, I don't think we did. I guess my question in respect to that is, should we be doing that? We voted on a $65 million plan, and I think there have been change, and we have to vote on everything over 50. So moving forward, if we're going to do 20 million, that's going to be a discussion because we can't do that again. Okay? So I'm sorry I went on for a while. I just wanted you guys to have a good understanding of that. And so back to Commissioner Drillette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The point you made is well taken, that when property values recover, the money that comes to government based on millages doesn't recover at the same rate. But I also think it's important to point out that people don't pay their taxes with their property. They pay it with their income. And people's income in Michigan, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is still about 8% below where it was before the Great Recession. So while their property might be worth more, their incomes aren't back to where they were. And I just think it's important to think about that, and I hope that we can look at the possibility of doing a scheduled rollback. I recognize that we can't do $10 million 1 year, but perhaps we can look at some way of incorporating that moving forward. And I appreciate your other points, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any other commissioners on the presentation? All right. Sorry. We're letting you go for a little while. Okay, new business. Is there any new business? Okay, public participation.
Greetings once again, Macomb County Board of Commissioners. That was an enlightening, brief presentation regarding the budget. And I think one of the things that Steve Smigiel had indicated, that there has to be a rein on discretionary spending. And I think that this is the idea when dealing with a large amount of bonds being floated around for specific purposes, the issue comes down to discretionary spending. As I was mentioning earlier regarding those check registers that are readily available to the public to look at, the issue does come down to is the Capital Improvement Fund, Capital Project Fund was created back in 2014. So anybody that knows how to use a computer and the internet can actually go in and allocate in one spreadsheet all of the monthly expenditures from that fund and then organize them by column, by vendor, and figure out where the discretionary spending is not really happening. I was floored when I actually saw exactly how much was going towards the architecture fees and for the general contractor on the project. But I also noticed that there was a lot of infrastructure costs, such as wiring and computers and screens and iPhones and everything along the lines regarding does the County of Macomb actually need to spend money on these particular items? Now, the idea behind it going from 2014 to the current present July of 2017, there's a large amount of money that's been expended on outsourced IT contract vendors to solve problems within the IT infrastructure itself. And it appears to me, based upon some of the billings, that there's double billing. The issue does come down to, of course, it was a year ago at this time I started coming to the budget hearings, and I was part of like a group that was going around and saying, we need a forensic audit, forensic audit, forensic audit. Well, what is wrong with the Plant Moran audit that the county currently pays for? The answer to that is a forensic audit would actually go through and determine exactly what type of expenditures are coming out of the $65 million and why it has been almost blown to this point. Now, there's a lot of good things that have taken place, such as the demolition of that parking structure for the new parking structure. But at the same time, I would say discretionary spending. If we really want to put a handle on discretionary spending, you would need to take a look at the capital improvement plan and definitely try to find out why it is that many of these vendors are basically always turning in these monthly bills that seem like duplicates on whether or not the actual work is being performed. I mentioned the outsourced IT vendor because of the clerk liaison in the clerk's office who is turning in bills for work that the clerk is not aware were being performed. An audit would actually handle that. An inquiry into the finance department could potentially lead to answers being created in order to understand whether or not these vendors have just all of a sudden decided that they're going to turn in 45 hours for this, and nobody knows exactly what it is that they did, except this is called planned obsolescence. In order to put a handle on discretionary spending, you have to identify who are the vendors turning in all of these bills for what work have they performed in the last 3.5 years. I would say going after another $20 million would be feasible if we had a forensic audit of the Capital Project Fund and a lot of the different items associated with the items that were brought up last year by the clerk candidate, the public works candidate, and the treasurer's candidate said forensic audit. I think that you should allocate money towards a forensic audit because I believe that that would put in a rein into discretionary spending, especially when I look at the check registers. I see a lot of duplication of effort, and these are usually the friends of Hackle that give to his campaign. You see it in the campaign reports. It's hard not to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, motion to adjourn. Moved by Duje, supported by Drillette. Please vote on your iPad.